Dominic Moretti poured another glass of amber liquid that cost more than the average man's annual salary, staring out at the rain-lashed grounds of his Lake Forest estate while the silence of the house pressed against his skull like a physical weight. He had the power to burn Chicago to the ground with a single phone call, yet he stood there completely impotent because $50 million in bribes, flights, and experimental surgeries hadn't bought a single sound for his 8-year-old son. He had dragged Marco to the finest clinics in Switzerland and threatened the families of surgeons in Tokyo, but every expert simply took his money and offered the same damn apology, leaving him to believe this was God's retribution for the bodies he'd buried. He didn't know that the answer wasn't in a sterile lab in Geneva, but downstairs in the servants' quarters, hidden in the sharp eyes of a starving maid who had spotted the one thing the experts were paid to miss. When he would find her hovering over his son with a metal tool later that night, he wouldn't see a savior. He would see a threat to be eliminated, unaware that his blind rage was seconds away from silencing the only person who could hear the truth. The amber liquid burned a slow, familiar path down Dominic's throat, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the ice that had encased his chest for 8 years. He turned away from the rain-streaked window and walked to the threshold of the study, looking down into the vast, cavernous foyer where his son sat like a castaway on an island of Persian wool. Marco was 8 years old, but he looked smaller from this height, fragile in the way fine china is fragile, terrified that a clumsy hand might shatter him into irreparable pieces. The boy was lining up toy cars on the rug, his movements meticulous and obsessive, red car, blue car, red car, completely unaware that his father was watching him from the shadows above. It was a scene that should have been peaceful, a quiet domestic moment in a home that cost $15 million, yet it tore Dominic apart because he knew that if he shouted, if he screamed Marco's name until his lungs burned and his throat bled, the boy wouldn't even flinch. The staff moved around the child with a practiced, terrifying efficiency, gliding past him as if he were a piece of furniture or a ghost haunting the hallway. Dominic watched a maid dust the antique vase 3 feet from Marco's head without ever looking at the boy, without offering a smile or a wave or even a nod of acknowledgement. And he felt a surge of irrational anger that he quickly swallowed because he was the one who had built this world. He had created this fortress of silence to protect Marco, to keep him safe from the enemies who would look at a deaf son and see a weakness to be exploited, but instead, he had built a prison where his son was the solitary inmate. Even the bodyguards, men Dominic paid $200,000 a year to take a bullet without hesitation, stepped around the boy with averted eyes, uncomfortable with the silence, uncomfortable with the defect that their boss had spent a fortune trying to fix and failed. Dominic gripped the mahogany railing until his knuckles turned white, his eyes tracing the curve of Marco's jaw, a jaw that was a painful, perfect replica of Isabella's. Every time he looked at his son, he didn't just see a deaf child who couldn't understand why the world ignored him. He saw the woman he had buried 8 years ago, the woman whose life had bled out on a delivery table to bring this boy into the world. It was a cruel joke of fate that Marco had her eyes, her smile, and her hair, serving as a living, breathing monument to the greatest loss of Dominic's life. He wanted to go down there, to scoop the boy up and hold him against his chest until the loneliness dissolved, but the guilt was a physical barrier, a wall of fire he couldn't cross because deep down, he believed Marco's silence was his fault, a divine punishment for every life Dominic had ended, every sin he had committed in the name of power. The vibration of the phone in his pocket broke the trance, jarring him back to the cold reality of who he was and what he had to do to keep this silent kingdom standing. Dominic pulled the device out, seeing the name of his capo, Vince, flashing on the screen, and his face hardened instantly into the mask of the Silent King. He answered without a greeting, his voice dropping to the low, gravelly timbre that made grown men sweat and politicians reconsider their loyalties. Vince's voice crackled on the other end, hesitant and fearful, explaining that the Irish crew was pushing back on the south side distribution routes and demanding a bigger cut of the profits. Dominic didn't yell. He didn't need to raise his voice to be the most terrifying thing in the city. "Burn it," he commanded, the order leaving his lips as easily as an exhale, void of any hesitation or mercy. "Burn the warehouse to the ground and leave one alive to tell the others. If they want a war, I will give them an apocalypse." He ended the call and downed the rest of his scotch, the taste of peat mixing with the metallic tang of self-loathing, knowing he could order the destruction of an entire city block with a single word, yet he couldn't buy the one thing that mattered: the sound of his son saying the word Dad. The wind off Lake Michigan didn't just blow. It hunted, seeking out the rips in Elena's threadbare coat as she stood shivering at the desolate bus stop, her feet numb inside shoes held together by black duct tape and desperate hope. She checked her banking app for the third time in 5 minutes, though the number hadn't changed, staring at the screen until the pixels blurred into a mocking reminder of her failure. $6.40. That was the sum total of her existence, a pathetic figure that wouldn't even cover a round trip to the city, let alone the mountain of debt that was currently crushing the air out of her lungs. Her finger hovered over the voicemail icon, trembling not just from the biting cold, but from the nausea that roiled in her empty stomach, because she knew exactly what the message from Greenbrier Nursing Home would say. She pressed play, holding the phone to her ear as if it were a loaded gun, and listened to the administrative director's voice turn from professional courtesy to icy threats. The arrears had compounded again, the late fees stacking on top of the specialized cancer treatments until the total had ballooned to $45,000, a sum so impossible it might as well have been $1 billion. "Friday, Miss Carter," the voice said, final and unforgiving. "If the balance isn't cleared by Friday, we transfer your mother to the state facility." Elena closed her eyes, the tears freezing on her lashes before they could fall, because the state facility wasn't a hospital. It was a warehouse for the dying where underpaid staff changed sheets once a day and pain medication was rationed like gold. Ruth Carter, the woman who had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over Elena's head, the grandmother who had held Elena while she screamed over Lily's small coffin, deserved better than to die in a hallway smelling of urine and neglect. The bus screeched to a halt in front of her, the hydraulic hiss sounding like a beast exhaling, and Elena stepped on board, swiping her card and praying it wouldn't decline. She took a seat in the back, wrapping her arms around her chest to preserve what little body heat she had left, watching the city landscape shift from the cracked pavement of the slums to the manicured perfection of Lake Forest. She wasn't just going to a job interview, she was marching into a war zone with nothing but a mop and a prayer, desperate to secure the housekeeping position at the Moretti estate because the rumors said Dominic Moretti paid 3 times the market rate for silence. The iron gates of the estate loomed over the street like the entrance to a fortress, crowned with spikes that glinted sharply in the pale winter sun. Elena pressed the buzzer, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stated her name to the camera that tracked her movement with a mechanical, predatory gaze. When the gates groaned open, she walked the half-mile driveway, feeling the eyes of unseen watchers on her back, the gravel crunching loudly under her taped shoes in the unnerving quiet. 2 men in black suits met her at the service entrance, their faces blank and hard, looking less like security guards and more like executioners waiting for an order. They didn't speak a word of greeting, simply motioning for her to raise her arms while one passed a metal detector over her shivering frame and the other rifled through her worn handbag, dumping her meager possessions onto a steel table. They examined her chapstick, her wallet, and the photo of Lily she kept tucked in the lining, their rough hands violating the sanctity of her small life before nodding her through the heavy steel door. Inside, the mansion was warmer than the outside air, but the atmosphere was somehow colder, a sterile, suffocating chill that seeped into the marrow. Mrs. Webb, the head housekeeper, stood in the center of the kitchen like a statue carved from gray stone, her uniform immaculate and her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She looked Elena up and down, her gaze lingering with disdain on the taped shoe, but she didn't send her away, presumably because nobody else was desperate enough to work in the house of the Silent King. "You are here to work, not to live," Mrs. Webb said, her voice dry and clipped, devoid of any human warmth. "We pay for perfection, and we pay for invisibility. If you break a glass, you pay for it. If you steal a spoon, the police will not be called, but you will regret it. And if you speak out of turn, you will be removed before you finish your sentence." Elena nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in her throat because she needed this paycheck more than she needed her dignity. Mrs. Webb turned on her heel and led the way through the labyrinth and corridors, her orthopedic shoes making no sound on the gleaming marble floors, while Elena hurried to keep up. "There are rules, Miss Carter, and they are not suggestions," Mrs. Webb continued, gesturing vaguely to the expanses of polished wood and gold leaf. "Rule number 1 is silence. Mr. Moretti does not tolerate noise. Rule number 2 is simple. You do not look Mr. Moretti in the eye. He is the master of this house, and you are a shadow. Shadows do not have eyes." She stopped abruptly at the foot of the grand staircase, turning to face Elena with an expression that was almost fearful. "And rule number 3 is the most important. You will see a boy in this house, the young master. You do not speak to him. You do not touch him. You pretend he does not exist." Elena frowned, the instruction jarring against her instincts. "The son," she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "But surely if he needs something." The last girl who thought she could befriend the child disappeared, Mrs. Webb hissed, leaning in close, her breath smelling of peppermint and anxiety. She thought she was special. She thought she could fix things. She was wrong. Do not make the same mistake. Before Elena could process the threat, movement at the top of the stairs caught her eye. A small figure sat on the landing, framed by the towering columns of the upper gallery. It was the boy, Marco. He was wearing a white shirt that was pressed to perfection and black slacks, looking like a miniature adult attending a funeral, but his posture was all child. He sat with his knees pulled to his chest, his head resting on the railing, staring down into the foyer with eyes that held a depth of sorrow no 8-year-old should possess. Elena felt the air leave her lungs because for a split second, it wasn't a strange boy sitting there, it was Lily. It was the same slump of the shoulders, the same isolation, the same silent plea for someone, anyone, to notice that they were hurting. He looked down, his gaze sweeping over the servants who busied themselves dusting the chandelier, and then his eyes locked onto Elena. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just looked at her with a profound, crushing loneliness that mirrored the hole in her own heart. Elena wanted to raise her hand, to offer a smile, to let him know he wasn't invisible, but Mrs. Webb's warning rang in her ears like a siren. "You pretend he does not exist." She lowered her head, breaking the connection, and focused her eyes on her taped shoes, her heart aching with a familiar grief. She had come here to save her mother, to fight a battle against debt and death, but looking at the boy on the stairs, she realized she had walked into a house that was already dead, occupied by ghosts who just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The marble floors of the Moretti estate were not just a surface to be walked upon, they were a vast, unforgiving altar that demanded daily sacrifice, and Elena offered hers in the form of cracked skin and knees that burned with a dull, throbbing fire. For 3 weeks, she had become a ghost in a machine of opulence, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean and polishing silver that no one used, her existence reduced to the rhythmic swish of a rag and the gnawing emptiness of her stomach. Mrs. Webb rationed the staff meals with a miser's precision, leaving Elena to survive on the stale crusts of bread discarded from the master's table, wrapping them in napkins and eating them in the dark of the laundry room while the smell of roast lamb and rosemary drifted down from the kitchen like a cruel taunt. She was starving, her uniform hanging loosely on a frame that had once been soft and maternal, yet the physical hunger paled in comparison to the terror that woke her every morning at 4. the digital clock ticking down the hours until Friday, when her mother would be thrown into the state facility to die alone. Elena's world narrowed down to the rhythm of the scrub brush, but her eyes, traitorous to Mrs. Webb's commands, kept drifting to the boy who haunted the sunroom like a shadow detached from its owner. Marco spent his afternoons there, bathed in the cold winter light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by expensive puzzles and model airplanes that he assembled with a joyless, mechanical intensity. He was always alone, separated from the rest of the house by an invisible barrier of silence and fear, as the bodyguards stood like statues at the end of the corridor, refusing to look at the boss's broken son. But Elena watched him, and as the days bled into one another, she began to notice a pattern that the expensive specialists and the terrified staff had seemingly ignored. Marco didn't just exist in silence, he lived in discomfort. Every few minutes, his hand would drift up to his right ear, his small fingers digging into the soft skin behind the lobe, his face tightening in a grimace that was not born of boredom, but of sharp, shooting pain. The motion was so small, so seemingly insignificant, that 100 doctors had missed it, yet it struck Elena with the force of a physical blow, freezing her hand mid-scrub as a memory from 3 years ago clawed its way out of the grave. She saw Lily, her sweet, blue-eyed Lily, sitting on the edge of her toddler bed, rubbing her ear with that exact same frantic, pleading motion while tears streamed down her fever-flushed cheeks. "Mommy, it hurts," Lily had whispered, her voice thick with infection, and Elena had rushed her to the clinic, holding her tight while the doctor explained how the pressure built up behind the drum. Marco was doing the same thing, hitting the side of his head with the heel of his hand as if trying to dislodge water, his mouth opening in a silent cry of frustration that banished into the uncaring air of the mansion. It wasn't the behavior of a child who was simply deaf, it was the behavior of a child who was suffering, trapped inside a body that was screaming a message no one was listening to. It happened on a Tuesday, in the heavy silence of the afternoon while the storm clouds gathered over Lake Michigan, turning the light in the sunroom to a bruised purple. Elena was polishing the baseboards near the doorway, her presence masked by the shadows, when Marco let out a sharp, strangled sound of distress. He had been trying to snap the wing onto a complex model fighter jet, but his hands were shaking from the agitation of his pain, and the plastic strut had snapped, sending the pieces scattering across the hardwood floor. He stared at the broken toy, his chest heaving, and then he simply gave up, dropping his head into his hands and curling inward, a portrait of absolute defeat that shattered the last remnant of Elena's self-preservation. Rule number 3 screamed in her mind, never touch the boy, never speak to the boy, but the mother in her, the part of her that had failed to save Lily, refused to stand by and watch another child drown in despair. She moved before she could think, crossing the boundary of the sunroom with silent, stocking-footed steps, dropping to her knees beside the weeping boy. Marco flinched violently, scrambling backward as if he expected to be struck, his brown eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion because no one, not in years, had ever entered his circle of isolation. Elena didn't reach for him, knowing that touch would be too much, too soon. Instead, she reached for the broken model, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She picked up the snapped wing and the fuselage, examining the brake, and then, with a deft twist and a bit of pressure, she locked the pieces back together, the plastic clicking into place. She set the repaired plane gently in front of him, then lifted her eyes to meet his, waiting for him to look at her, really look at her, not as a uniform, but as a person. When his gaze finally lifted from the toy to her face, Elena raised her hands. She didn't speak, knowing the vibrations would only startle him or alert the guards, so she let her fingers dance in the air, shaping the signs she had learned in the desperate hope of teaching Lily a language she would never live to use. She tapped her forehead, then moved her hand away in a salute. "Hello." She hooked her index fingers together, linking them tight. Friend. Marco stared at her hands, his mouth falling open slightly, his breath hitching in his chest as the realization washed over him. He knew the signs. His father had hired tutors years ago before giving up, but no one had ever signed to him with kindness, only with the clinical detachment of a lesson. A trembling smile broke across Marco's face, tentative and fragile like the first crack of dawn, and he slowly raised his own small hands to mimic her. Friend, he signed back, his movements clumsy but eager, his eyes shining with a sudden, desperate hope that made Elena's heart ache. For a heartbeat, the distance between the billionaire's son and the pauper's daughter vanished, bridged by a single silent word, but then the sharp, rhythmic click of hard-soled shoes echoed from the hallway. Mrs. Webb. The sound was a thunderclap of reality. Elena scrambled to her feet, grabbing her bucket and rags, her heart slamming against her ribs as she retreated into the shadows of the corridor, vanishing just as the head housekeeper turned the corner, leaving Marco sitting alone with his fixed plane, staring at the empty space where the first kindness he had known in years had just disappeared. The cigar smoke drifting up from the grand drawing room was thick enough to taste, a heavy, acrid cloud of tobacco and vice that clung to the back of Elena's throat as she stood in the shadowed hallway of the second floor. Downstairs, the house was vibrating with the low, menacing rumble of the 5 families, men who divided the city's criminal enterprises over tumblers of scotch and hands of poker, their laughter sounding like grinding stones. It was the perfect distraction, a chaotic shield of masculinity and power that left the upper levels of the estate deceptively silent, save for the frantic hammering of Elena's own heart. She should have been in the basement laundry room, folding the endless piles of white linens, but the image of Marco hitting the side of his head against the wall earlier that day refused to let her rest. It gnawed at her, a physical ache in her chest that felt too much like the phantom weight of her dead daughter, screaming at her that the boy wasn't just deaf, but that he was being tortured by something his own father was too blinded by guilt and grief to see. She moved toward the master study with the quiet desperation of a thief, knowing that if Mrs. Webb or one of the patrolling guards found her here, she wouldn't just be fired, she would be erased from existence. The heavy oak door was unlatched, slipping open on well-oiled hinges to reveal a room that smelled of old leather, expensive bourbon, and the lingering, metallic tang of gun oil. Elena didn't dare turn on the overhead chandelier, guiding herself instead by the pale, wintry moonlight that sliced through the heavy velvet drapes, her hands shaking as she approached the massive mahogany desk that served as the throne of the Silent King. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that the answers to Marco's pain had to be buried somewhere in the mountains of paperwork that Dominic kept like holy scriptures, documenting every failed attempt to fix his son. She bypassed the drawers locked with biometric scanners, knowing she had no hope there, and went for the filing cabinet in the corner labeled medical, praying that a man who could buy the police force hadn't felt the need to lock up the evidence of his son's tragedies. The drawer slid open with a soft hiss, revealing rows of color-coded files that chronicled a decade of futile hope and staggering expense. Elena pulled them out one by one, using the small flashlight she had swiped from the supply closet, the narrow beam illuminating a financial horror story that made her stomach churn. Johns Hopkins, the Mayo Clinic, a private specialist in Zurich, the numbers were astronomical, columns of expenditures that totaled over $50 million, enough money to feed a small country, all spent on a child who still sat in silence. But it wasn't the total that stopped her breath. It was a thin, unassuming folder tucked at the very back, labeled Dr. Howard Stern, confidential. Elena opened it, expecting more test results, but what she found was a letter typed on thick, creamy bond paper, dated 5 years ago. The words seemed to swim before her eyes, refusing to coalesce into reality because the cruelty they described was too vast to comprehend. Subject exhibits localized obstruction in the right auditory canal due to keratosis obturans, The report read, the medical jargon dry and clinical, hiding the monstrous truth in plain sight. But the handwritten note scrawled beneath it in red ink was what made the bile rise in Elena's throat. Do not remove. Condition stable but symptomatic. Patient is a Class A revenue source. Continued palliative care recommended. Monthly retainer, $250,000. Elena clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp, the paper trembling in her grip as the realization hit her like a physical blow. They knew. The doctors, the specialists, the men Dominic trusted with his son's life, they all knew. They had looked into Marco's ear, seen a blockage that could be removed, and chosen to leave it there, sentencing a child to a world of silence and pain so they could milk his father for $250,000 a month. The sound of the doorknob turning was loud enough to stop her heart. Elena froze, the flashlight clicking off in her sweaty palm, panic seizing her limbs with an icy grip as the hallway lights spilled into the room. There was no time to run, no time to put the file back, so she shoved the folder into the waistband of her skirt and threw herself behind the heavy velvet curtains that lined the floor-to-ceiling window. She pressed herself against the cold glass, making herself as thin as a shadow, just as the door swung open and the overhead lights flooded the room. Through the narrow gap in the fabric, she saw him. Dominic Moretti walked in, his suit jacket discarded, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the dark ink of a tattoo climbing his throat. He looked exhausted, a man carrying the weight of the world on shoulders that were broad but bowing, and he moved to the wall safe, punching in a code with quick, aggressive movements. Elena held her breath until her lungs burned, watching the man she was terrified of, the man who killed without blinking, yet who was being played for a fool by men in white coats. He pulled a thick stack of cash from the safe, likely for the game downstairs, and for a moment he paused, his head tilting as if he sensed a foreign presence in his sanctuary. He sniffed the air, and Elena realized with a jolt of terror that he might smell her fear, or the cheat soak she used, scents that didn't belong in this room of expensive scotch and danger. He took a step toward the window, his hand drifting toward the gun tucked in his waistband, and Elena squeezed her eyes shut, preparing to die. But then a shout erupted from downstairs, a roar of laughter and the crash of glass, and the moment broke. Dominic turned, grabbing the cash and the bottle of scotch from his desk, and strode out of the room, flipping the lights off and plunging Elena back into the darkness. She slid to the floor, shaking so hard her teeth rattled, clutching the stolen file against her stomach, knowing that she was now carrying a secret that could get her killed, or set a little boy free. The storm that hit Chicago that night didn't just rain, it declared war on the earth, turning the sky into a bruising canvas of purple and black, while thunder rattled the Georgian columns of the Moretti estate like the bars of a cage. Elena stood in the servants' quarters, the stolen medical file burning a hole in her mattress where she had hidden it, listening to the wind howl with a ferocity that matched the turmoil in her own gut. She had spent the last 24 hours paralyzed by the knowledge that Marco was being tortured for profit, but the weather seemed to bring a new, immediate danger, a shift in air pressure that made her scars ache and her instincts scream. She was supposed to be invisible, supposed to be scrubbing the mudroom, yet a hollow, rhythmic thumping from the floor above drew her up the back stairs, pulling her toward the boys' room with the magnetic force of a mother hearing her child cry in the dark. What she found in the upstairs corridor shattered her composure completely, driving the air from her lungs as she dropped to her knees beside the small, writhing figure of the boy. Marco was no longer just rubbing his ear. He was clawing at it, his fingernails digging furrows into his own skin until blood smeared across his cheek, mixing with the sweat that drenched his pale face. He was burning up, radiating a heat that felt dangerous even through his pajama shirt. His eyes rolled back in his head as he rocked back and forth, his mouth open in a silent, agonizing scream that no one else cared to hear. It wasn't a tantrum, and it wasn't behavior. It was the frantic, primal response to an infection that had likely breached the bone, the pressure behind that calcified wax plug building until it felt like a drill boring into a skull. Elena grabbed his hands, forcing them away from his mutilated skin, and when he looked at her, she didn't see the Mafia boss's son. She saw Lily in her final hours, the glazing of the eyes, the fading of the light, the terrifying slide toward a darkness from which there was no return. Panic, cold and sharp, propelled Elena down the hallway to the housekeeper's suite, where she hammered on the door with a force that bruised her knuckles. Mrs. Webb opened it, looking annoyed rather than concerned, her gaze flicking to Elena's disheveled uniform with disdain. "He needs a doctor," Elena gasped, breathless and trembling. "Marco, he has a fever. He's bleeding. You have to call an ambulance." But Mrs. Webb didn't reach for a phone. She simply crossed her arms, her face settling into a mask of stone. "Mr. Moretti is in the library with the captains from Detroit," she stated, as if that explained everything. "We are on lockdown. No one comes in, no one goes out, and we certainly do not disturb the boss with the boys' hysterics. Go back to your room, Miss Carter." Elena stared at her, horrified by the casual cruelty, realizing that to these people, Marco's pain was just background noise, an inconvenience to be managed while the men discussed territory and murder. Elena turned and ran back to Marco, knowing with a terrifying clarity that if she waited until morning, the boy would be dead or permanently brain damaged. The file in her room had said symptomatic, but the heat radiating off him now screamed septic. The infection was trapped behind the blockage, festering, and without release, it would travel inward, straight to the meninges of the brain. She was alone. There was no doctor coming, no father to save him, just a maid with $6 in her bank account and a debt that was about to kill her mother. She looked at Marco's tear-streaked face, saw the absolute trust in his eyes even through the haze of pain, and made a decision that would likely end her life. She would not let him die. She would not let another child fade away in her arms while the world turned its back. She moved with the focused efficiency of a soldier preparing for a suicide mission, slipping into the master bathroom while the guards were distracted by the storm and the war meeting downstairs. Her hands shook as she raided the cabinet, her fingers closing around a bottle of high-proof rubbing alcohol, a clean stack of gauze, and a pair of precision surgical tweezers that Dominic likely used for splinters, cold, sharp steel that glinted in the lightning flashes. She shoved them into her pocket and retreated to the small desk in her room for one final act. She took a napkin and a pen, writing a shaky, tear-stained note to her mother, telling her she loved her, telling her she was sorry she couldn't pay the debt, telling her that she tried to do the right thing. She left the note on her pillow, a testament to her existence, and stepped out into the dark hallway, the thunder covering the sound of her footsteps as she walked toward the boys' room to perform a surgery she was terrified to start, but unable to refuse. The hallway felt like a tunnel closing in on her, the walls of the mansion breathing with the heaviness of the storm while Elena crept toward the door that separated a suffering child from the apathy of his world. She slipped inside Marco's room, the door clicking shut behind her with a sound that felt final, sealing her fate as surely as a judge's gavel. The room was illuminated only by the erratic flashes of lightning that tore through the curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the bed where Marco lay curled in a fetal ball of misery. He was shivering violently, his small body racked with the tremors of a fever that was burning him from the inside out, his hands still clutching at his ear as if trying to tear the pain out by the roots. Elena moved to the bedside, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and placed a cool hand on his forehead, the heat radiating from his skin confirming her worst fears. The infection wasn't just local anymore, it was systemic, a poison spreading through his blood because the men paid to protect him saw him as nothing more than a broken ATM machine. Marco's eyes flew open, wide and glassy with terror, but when he saw Elena, the panic didn't escalate. It paused, suspended by the fragile thread of trust she had spun between them over broken toys and silent signals. She didn't waste time trying to speak words he couldn't hear. Instead, she lifted her hands into the dim light, forcing her fingers to stop trembling long enough to sign. "Trust me," she moved her hands slowly, deliberately. "I hope. Pain stop." Marco stared at her, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths, tears leaking from the corners of his eyes to soak into the silk pillowcase. He looked at the metal tweezers in her other hand, gleaming sharply in the gloom, and then back at her face. It was a terrifying ask to let a stranger poke a steel instrument into the very source of his agony, yet the desperation in him was stronger than the fear. He gave a tiny, jerky nod and squeezed his eyes shut, surrendering himself to her completely because he had no one else left to save him. Elena swallowed the bile rising in her throat and switched on the small flashlight, holding it between her teeth to keep her hands free while she poured the rubbing alcohol over the tweezers. The sharp, sterile scent filled the air, cutting through the smell of fever and sickness, a chemical promise of action. She gently tilted Marco's head to the side, exposing the inflamed, red outer ear, and shone the beam directly into the canal. What she saw made her knees weak. The blockage wasn't just a simple wax buildup. It was a wall, a dense, blackened mass of keratoses obturans that had impacted against the sensitive skin of the canal for years, hardening until it mimicked the density of stone. It was ugly and angry, the edges rimmed with pus where the infection was trying to break through, a physical manifestation of the neglect Marco had endured. The doctors had called this a bony tumor, a lie so brazen it made Elena want to scream, but she channeled that rage into her hands, forcing them into a stillness she didn't feel. She leaned in, the world narrowing down to the circle of light and the terrifyingly small margin for error. "Don't move, baby, please don't move," she prayed silently as she guided the cold steel into the air canal. Marco whimpered, a sound that was felt more than heard, his small hands gripping the bed sheets until his knuckles turned white, but he stayed still, freezing with the instinct of a prey animal hoping to survive. Elena felt the metal tip click against the mass, a hard, unyielding sensation that traveled up her arm. She tried to find purchase on the edge, but it was slick with discharge and wedged tight, fused to the canal wall like a barnacle. She had to go deeper. She adjusted her angle, sliding one prong of the tweezers between the tender, inflamed skin and the hard plug, risking a puncture to get leverage. Marco arched his back, a silent scream stretching his mouth wide, but Elena didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The smell of iron and infection wafted up as she dug in, clamping the tweezers down with a force she feared would snap the delicate tool. She had a grip now, a precarious hold on the center of the obstruction. I'm so sorry," she thought, tears blurring her own vision as she braced her other hand against his head for stability. She pulled. It didn't budge. It was anchored deep, held fast by years of accumulation. She pulled harder, applying a steady, increasing tension that felt brutal, like tearing a tooth from a jaw. Blood began to well up around the tweezers, dark and ominous in the flashlight's beam, running down Marco's neck and staining the pristine collar of his pajamas. The boy was thrashing now, his control breaking under the agony, but Elena leaned her body weight over him, pinning him gently but firmly with her forearm. "Almost there," she whispered into the thunder, though he couldn't hear her. "Just one more. Come on." She gritted her teeth and gave a final, wrenching tug, putting every ounce of her maternal desperation into the motion, willing the dam to break before the boy did. The resistance gave way with a sickening, audible pop, a sound like a cork being pulled from a bottle of spoiled wine, and suddenly the tension that had held the room captive snapped. Elena fell back slightly, her hand trembling violently as she stared at the object clamped in the jaws of the tweezers, a dense, blackened nugget the size of a large marble, hideous and malformed, glistening with the fluids of an infection that had been festering for half a decade. It was a physical manifestation of neglect, a piece of calcified debris that had stolen 8 years of a child's life, and as she dropped it onto the nightstand with a wet clatter, the smell of decay filled the small space between them. Marco gasped, a ragged intake of breath that sounded too loud in the sudden silence, his eyes flying wide as his hands flew up to cover his ears, not in pain, but in sheer, overwhelming shock. For the first time in his life, the world wasn't a silent movie. It was a cacophony of sensation, the drumming of the rain against the glass, the heavy thud of thunder rolling overhead, the ragged sound of his own breathing. All of it rushing into his brain with the force of a tidal wave. But before Elena could wrap her arms around him, before she could whisper the reassurance that everything was going to be all right, the heavy oak door to the bedroom exploded inward with a crash that shook the floorboards. Dominic Moretti stood in the threshold, framed by the hallway light like an avenging angel cast in iron and blood, his suit soaked through from the storm, and his chest heaving with the exertion of a man who had run up 3 flights of stairs. He had returned early, the meeting in Detroit cut short by a paranoid instinct that whispered something was wrong at home, and now, standing there with rain dripping from his hair and adrenaline flooding his veins, his worst nightmare seemed to have materialized before him. He didn't see a miracle. He didn't see a woman saving his child. He saw a stranger hovering over his son's bed in the dead of night, a sharp metal instrument gleaming in her hand, and worst of all, he saw the bright, crimson smear of fresh blood on the white pillowcase next to Marco's head. The roar that tore from his throat was not human. It was the sound of a predator whose territory had been breached, a guttural, terrifying noise that froze the blood in Elena's veins. "You," he screamed, the word vibrating with lethal intent, and before Elena could even raise her hands in surrender, he was on her. He moved with a speed that defied physics, crossing the room in a blur of violence that gave her no time to scream, no time to explain, no time to do anything but brace for impact. His hand, large and hard as a sledgehammer, slammed into her shoulder, lifting her off her knees and hurling her backward with a force that knocked the wind out of her before she even hit the ground. She flew across the room, her body colliding with the wall near the window with a bone-jarring thud that rattled her teeth and sent a shockwave of agony down her spine, the tweezers skittering across the floor to vanish under the dresser. Elena slid to the floor, gasping for air that wouldn't come, her vision swimming in a haze of black spots, but Dominic wasn't finished. He didn't stop to check on Marco. His singular, blinding focus was the elimination of the threat, the neutralization of the creature that had dared to touch his blood. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, reaching down to grab a fistful of her uniform, hauling her to her feet as if she weighed nothing more than a rag doll. He slammed her back against the wall again, his forearm pressing against her windpipe, pinning her there with a crushing weight that cut off her air supply instantly. "You touched him," he hissed, his face inches from hers, his eyes black pits of absolute, unthinking rage. "I gave you a job. I gave you a roof. And you come into my son's room with a weapon? You made him bleed." Elena clawed at his arm, her fingernails scraping uselessly against the expensive fabric of his suit, her legs kicking feebly as the lack of oxygen began to turn the edges of her vision gray. She tried to speak, tried to force the words "I saved him" past the crushing pressure on her larynx, but only a strangled, pathetic wheeze escaped her lips. Dominic didn't hear it. He was deaf to everything but the pounding of his own heart and the primitive directive to kill. He was a man who had buried bodies in the foundations of skyscrapers, a man who had ordered executions over stolen shipments, and right now he was looking at the woman he believed was an assassin sent to finish what fate had started. He tightened his grip, his thumb digging into the soft hollow of her throat, squeezing the life out of her with a terrifying, methodical precision. "I will kill you," he whispered, the promise hanging in the air like smoke. "I will take you apart piece by piece." Elena looked into his eyes and saw no recognition, no mercy, only the abyss. She stopped fighting, her arms dropping to her sides as her strength failed, her mind flashing to Lily one last time. She had failed her daughter, but she had succeeded here. Marco could hear. The thought was a small, warm light in the encroaching darkness. It's okay, she thought, the darkness rushing in to claim her. I did it. I saved him. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the inevitable, waiting for the snap that would end her life, unaware that the only thing that could stop the monster was the voice of the boy he was trying to avenge. The sound that tore through the suffocating violence of the room wasn't a scream of pain, nor was it the gargling gasp of a dying woman. It was a single, jagged word that sliced through 8 years of silence like a serrated blade. Dad. The syllable was raw, unformed, tearing from a throat that had never learned the shape of language, yet it carried a force that hit Dominic Moretti harder than a bullet to the chest. He froze, his hand still clamped around Elena's windpipe, his muscles locked in a spasm of lethal intent while his brain struggled to process the impossibility of what his ears had just registered. He thought he was hallucinating, that the stress of the Detroit War and the storm had finally cracked his psyche, conjuring ghosts from the silence he hated so much. But then the sound came again, louder this time, desperate and terrified. Dad, stop. Dominic's grip went slack, his fingers losing their strength as if the nerve endings had been severed, and Elena slumped to the floor, coughing violently as air rushed back into her starving lungs. He didn't look at her. He turned slowly, moving with the disjointed stiffness of a man waking from a nightmare, his eyes locking onto the bed where his son stood trembling. Marco wasn't looking at the woman on the floor anymore. He was looking at the window, flinching violently every time the thunder cracked overhead, a reaction so visceral, so undeniably responsive to the acoustic violence of the storm, that it shattered Dominic's reality in an instant. The boy who had slept through construction work, through sirens, through his mother's death, was now clutching his ears, his eyes wide with the sensory overload of a world that had suddenly turned up the volume to a deafening roar. Marco saw his father turn, saw the monster in the suit melt back into the man he yearned for, and he lowered his hands, pointing a shaking finger toward the antique grandfather clock that stood in the corner of the room. Tick, he stammered, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together, clumsy but unmistakable. Tick, tick, tick. He mimicked the rhythm that had been the background noise of his life, but never a part of his reality, his chest heaving with the effort of pushing the sounds out. Dominic stumbled forward, his legs hitting the edge of the mattress, his breath hitching in a sob that he couldn't suppress. He reached out, his hand hovering over Marco's face, afraid that if he made contact, the illusion would shatter and he would wake up back in the silence. Marco, he whispered, the name leaving his lips as a question, a prayer, a plea for this to be real. Marco didn't need to read his lips. He heard the vibration, the deep, rumbling baritone of his father's voice, and a fresh wave of tears spilled down his cheeks. He lunged forward, throwing his arms around Dominic's neck, burying his face in the damp wool of the suit jacket. Dad, he sobbed, the word clearer now, fueled by the sheer emotional release of a child who had been trapped behind a glass wall for a lifetime. Dominic wrapped his arms around the boy, crushing him against his chest, feeling the small heart hammering against his own, and for the first time in a decade, the silent king wept. He cried with a ferocity that shook his frame, great, racking heaves of sorrow and relief that stripped away the armor of the Mafia boss and left only a father holding his miracle. On the floor, Elena dragged herself into a sitting position, every breath a battle against the bruising swelling of her throat, her vision still swimming with gray spots. She saw the reunion through a haze of pain, saw the monster who had tried to kill her transform into a broken man, but the anger she should have felt was buried under a profound, exhausting relief. She spotted the tweezers sticking out from under the dresser and crawled toward them, her limbs heavy as lead, grabbing the instrument and the blackened mass of calcified wax that lay beside it. She used the dresser for support to pull herself up, swaying on her feet, clutching her bruised neck with one hand and holding out the evidence with the other. It wasn't incurable, she rasped, her voice a wrecked whisper that sounded like sandpaper dragging over stone. Dominic lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and wild, looking at her as if he had forgotten she was in the room. He stared at the object in her hand, the disgusting, pea-sized lump of black matter that she held out like a holy relic. "What is that?" he asked, his voice thick with tears and confusion. "It's a plug," Elena said, forcing the words out despite the agony in her throat. "Keratosis. It's been there for years. It blocked everything." She took a staggering step closer, dropping the mass onto the nightstand next to the lamp so he could see it clearly. The doctors, Dr. Stern, they knew. It was in the file. They left it there. They let him suffer so they could keep billing you. The truth hung in the air between them, heavier than the humidity of the storm, a revelation so monstrous it sucked the oxygen out of the room. Dominic looked at the black mass, then at his son's ear, seeing the trace of blood and the clear canal, and the pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a train collision. The monthly payments, the vague excuses, the palliative care that cost $250,000 a month. They hadn't failed to cure his son, they had monetized his son's disability. A coldness settled over Dominic, different from the rage that had nearly killed Elena, a terrifying, glacial calm that belonged to the man who ruled the underworld. He gently untangled Marco's arms from his neck, kissing the boy's forehead with a tenderness that belied the murder rising in his heart, and stood up. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, seeing the bruises blooming on her throat in the shape of his own fingers, the split lip, the terror that still lingered in her blue eyes. He had almost killed the only person in the world who had given a damn about his son, the only person who had seen the truth through the lies of men with medical degrees. Shame, hot and acid, flooded his gut, warring with the incandescent fury he felt toward the men who had done this. "You saved him," Dominic said, his voice low, vibrating with a reverence that terrified her almost as much as his anger had. He took a step toward her, and Elena flinched, stepping back instinctively, her body remembering the violence even if her mind understood the shift. Dominic stopped immediately, holding his hands up in surrender, his face twisting with self-loathing. I am sorry," he choked out, the apology foreign on his tongue but necessary. "I didn't know. I thought." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the horror of what he had almost done. He looked back at Marco, who was now sitting on the bed, pressing his hand to the window glass to feel the vibration of the thunder, fascinated by the scary, beautiful noise of the world. "Vince," Dominic said, the name a command spoken to the empty air, but he was already reaching for his phone, his fingers punching in the number with lethal precision. He didn't take his eyes off the black mass on the nightstand, the physical proof of the betrayal that had stolen his son's childhood. When his capo answered, Dominic's voice was dead calm, the voice of a man who had already passed sentence. "Get the car. We're going to the hospital. And send a team to Dr. Stern's house. Don't kill him. Not yet. Bring him to the warehouse. I want him to hear what I have to say before he goes deaf permanently." He hung up and turned back to Elena, extending a hand not to strike, but to offer support. "Let's get you a doctor," he said softly. "You're family now, and no one touches my family." The sterile white halls of Northwestern Memorial Hospital felt miles away from the dark, storm-battered bedroom where nearly 3 lives had ended, yet the silence here was different. It was the silence of anticipation, not despair. Dominic stood by the observation window, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing, watching the new team of specialists, doctors he had flown in within the hour, men whose families he didn't need to threaten because his reputation was enough. Run the final battery of tests on Marco. The lead audiologist stepped out, pulling off his mask with a look of professional disbelief, and delivered the verdict that shattered the last of Dominic's skepticism. 95%. Marco's hearing wasn't just improved, it was nearly perfect, the auditory nerve healthy and intact, having spent 8 years dormant behind a wall of wax and skin that a simple pair of tweezers had destroyed in seconds. Dominic listened to the science, but his mind was already miles away, calculating the cost of the years lost, the bedtime stories never heard, the I love yous that had fallen into a void. All because a group of men in white coats had decided his son was worth more as a patient than as a person. He walked away from the doctors without a word, stepping into the empty stairwell where the echo of his footsteps sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. He pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen illuminating the sharp angles of a face that had hardened back into stone, and dialed Vince. "Dr. Stern," he said, his voice devoid of any human emotion, cold enough to freeze the air in the concrete shaft. "I want him found tonight. Don't hurt him where it shows. Bring him to the warehouse on the docks and strap him to a chair. I want to whisper the truth in his ear, and I want to make sure he hears every single syllable before I take his license, his money, and his ability to ever sleep soundly again." He hung up, the sentence passed, the retribution set in motion like a grim machine that could not be stopped, and for the first time in years, the violence didn't feel like a sin, it felt like justice. 2 days later, the sun had returned to Lake Forest, bathing the estate in a golden light that seemed to mock the darkness of the past week. Yet inside the library, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Elena sat in the leather armchair that had once intimidated her, her hands resting nervously in her lap, the purple bruises on her neck fading to a sickly yellow, a physical reminder of the night she had almost died to save a child who wasn't hers. Dominic stood behind his desk, not as a king, but as a man trying to balance a ledger that could never truly be squared. He slid a check across the mahogany surface, the number written on it large enough to buy a house, a car, and a new life in a different city. $1 million, he stated, his eyes searching hers for a flicker of greed he knew he wouldn't find. "For saving my son. For the pain I caused you. Take it and go, Elena. You'll never have to scrub a floor again." Elena looked at the check, then up at the man who was offering her freedom, and slowly shook her head. She pushed the paper back toward him, her fingers trembling slightly but her gaze steady. "I didn't do it for money, Mr. Moretti," she said softly, the rasp in her voice catching on the words. "And I can't take blood money for an act of love. All I want, all I need, is for my mother's debt to be paid. $30,000 to the nursing home. That's it. Then I'll go." Dominic stared at her, stunned by integrity he had thought extinct in his world of transaction and betrayal. He picked up the check and tore it in half, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Done," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mother's debt is cleared. I bought the nursing home this morning. She will have the VIP suite and the best care until the end of her days." He walked around the desk, stopping in front of her, and dropped to one knee, lowering himself so he was looking up at the maid who had become his savior. "But I have a counteroffer. Don't go. Stay. Not as a maid. Stay as Marco's governess. Stay as family. He needs you, Elena. And I think I do too." A month later, the garden was alive with the sound of birds, a symphony of chirps and trills that had once been invisible to the boy running through the flower beds. Marco laughed, a bright, bubbling sound that rose into the air like a prayer answered, chasing a butterfly while listening to the crunch of his own sneakers on the gravel. Dominic stood on the patio, a glass of iced tea in his hand, watching his son discover the world one sound at a time, the perpetual frown that had etched lines into his forehead finally smoothed away. Elena stood beside him, no longer wearing a uniform, but a soft blue dress that caught the wind, her hand resting on the railing, her heart full in a way she hadn't felt since Lily died. Dominic reached out, covering her hand with his own, his grip warm and solid, a silent promise that the silence was over, replaced by a future that would be loud, messy, and beautiful. It is strange how life works, isn't it? We spend so much time looking for miracles in the grand and the expensive, trusting experts and titles, while the answers we desperately need are often hiding in the hands of the people we overlook. Elena wasn't a doctor, she wasn't rich, and she wasn't powerful, yet she saw what $50 million couldn't because she looked with her heart, not her wallet. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest heroes in our lives are the ones scrubbing the floors, the ones waiting at the bus stop, the ones who have nothing left to give but still find a way to save us. This is Sunni romance, and we hope this story touched something deep inside you today. We want to know, have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your worth? Or have you ever found help from the most unexpected place? Tell us your story in the comments below because we read every single one. If you believe in second chances and the power of kindness, please hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that matter. Until next time, remember to listen closely. The most important things are often whispered, not shouted.